Okay, I think we should begin. It's about 2 minutes past, and I obviously would like to get this session started this morning just because we've got a lot to cover. So just to introduce myself, my name is Tracy Boys. As I said, I am sitting in Cape Town, South Africa, if you can hear the accent, and I'm a data protection and privacy attorney. I've been practicing in this space for about 6 years now, and now I'm a member of the Scytale team, which is very exciting. And this morning I've got my esteemed guest, Wouter, joining me from the Netherlands. He's from Core Financial. So Wouter, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Wouter. As Tracy said, I work at Core Financial. We're a financial fintech startup going into scale up. We're heading into our fourth year and trying to disrupt some parts of the financial infrastructure. A very boring space, but a very exciting space to use technology and to be disrupting. Before this, I spent almost 2 decades in the United States, where I was heading up a lot of the innovations for United Airlines at the airports. So if you do self-tagging around the world, I had a big impact on that. And then after that, I spent some time at Ford Motors, working on the electronic vehicle when it was super secret. And the last 4 years, I moved back to Amsterdam to make my mom happy, so she could see her grandchildren more, and start joining Core, where I've been since the start, and on this journey, and we'll share some examples during this webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Wouter. Yeah, and as we're going through our session today, you can see there's obviously a Q&A. So if you've got some burning questions and you'd love to ask us, while I'm going through, maybe there's a particular topic I'm discussing at the time and you're thinking to yourself, sure, I actually have a question about that. So please pop your questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer them as we go. But yeah, as I said today, we're discussing the GDPR, which I'm sure some of you coming from Europe, you've heard lots about. And we're going to be talking about guidelines for startups. What can you do, and what can you do to get ready for the GDPR? Okay, so of course, as I said, you're probably thinking to yourself, if you've maybe, maybe you've just started your compliance journey when it comes to the GDPR, and you're wondering, what is this thing that everybody keeps talking about? So this is basically what I've specialized in my career. So I live and breathe GDPR, which might sound quite boring to some of you, but I find it quite exciting. So the General Data Protection Regulation is a regulation that obviously it covers the whole of Europe. So for those of you who aren't European, if something is a regulation in Europe, it covers everybody in the EU. So it's not just a guideline. The GDPR is one of the toughest privacy laws in the world, and it was enacted in May of 2018. And I think what makes the GDPR so different from other laws is generally when you think about a law, it's very black and white. So you mustn't steal, you mustn't commit fraud, you mustn't do tax evasion. It's quite black and white. What the GDPR did is that it said, okay, you need to do what is reasonable in the circumstance to comply. So when it comes to the GDPR, it's very different in that sense, in that it is a principle-based law. So it's almost, I would say, putting the emphasis actually on the person themselves or the company themselves to figure out, okay, here are the guidelines around compliance and how does my company fit within these guidelines? So it's very different from other laws in that instance. And what's also interesting about the GDPR is that it's got a very wide scope of application. So we call it in the law or the legal field, we say it's extraterritorial, which is also, once again, quite different from other laws. Most laws apply, I'm sitting in South Africa, for instance, so South African laws apply to me. Laws in the Netherlands, for instance, don't necessarily apply to me. However, the GDPR does. if I am processing European citizens' data. So extraterritorial means that the GDPR kind of follows EU citizens around the world. So it doesn't just apply within the European Union, but it also applies to you if you are processing European people's data from another country. So that's, I would say, I guess it shows you just how far-reaching the GDPR is. I know some people have had quite a bit of criticism around this, saying, Europe's trying to, I guess, stronghold or, change privacy around the world from Europe. I don't know, Wouter, if you've heard anything like this, or have you experienced anything like this around the GDPR? And I call it tentacles. That's very far-reaching.
Well, actually, like that's one of the learnings also working with you, that it wasn't just within the borders, but also protecting EU persons outside. It was more getting conscious of that. I thought it was very interesting learning in this process, because we didn't look at it that way. We were very much focused, like when we go to Europe and start selling there, because we started in the US, then we really need to focus on this. Come to find that, we may already have European customers that use our US product, and we should really focus on this sooner. So
yes. And I think that's almost where your mind starts just getting completely boggled. It's just, okay, like you said, I was focused in the US market, but oh my gosh, maybe I've got European citizens' data sitting on my database. Okay, what do I do about that? So I think that can actually, it can be quite scary to some people in terms of compliance, but don't worry, I have an answer for you in this presentation. And it'll come up shortly after the break. Also, what's quite interesting when it comes to the GDPR is that it's got very tough lines and really good regulators. So I don't want to scare anyone, but I think that's definitely the difference between some data privacy regimes versus others. So I'm going to use my home country as an instance. I don't think our fines are necessarily the toughest, just because our fines are limited at 10 million rand. So 10 million rand in South Africa is a huge amount of money. But if, for instance, one of our really, really big private companies were to get fined, they really wouldn't feel 10 million rand. And I think in various other countries, there are caps on fines. However, when it comes to the GDPR, it's 4% of global turnover. So that's also quite a difference there. So, I think it can hit hard, some companies versus others, just because it's a percentage. So I would say that the GDPR has probably got one of the toughest fines in the world, and the regulators are up and running. They've got really big employee bases that are working really hard on this. I always look at let's say the ICO in the UK. I think they've got like 800 people working for them. So it's a really big contingency of employees. So, if they're getting complaints, for instance, they've got the power to investigate and issue fines. So not to scare anybody, but I think that is the big difference when it comes to the GDPR, is that they will find you and they will fine you. So just be careful. And then, like I said, it is a principles-based law, so it's not a tick box exercise. And I think also what's really interesting when it comes to GDPR, and I've seen this time and time again when it comes to myself advising various clients and various organizations, is that you have to have a holistic approach to the GDPR. So you can't make this the IT person's problem, legal's problem, your CEO's problem. You can't just say, okay, well, Joe Soap in IT, he's dealing with it, and I don't need to worry about the GDPR. It doesn't really apply to me. I'm in accounts. It doesn't work for me. That's definitely something you can't do, unfortunately, because proper GDPR compliance within, your company and actually making it work, you have to have cultural change within your business. So, for instance, I've seen some people here from Berlin, for instance, and Berlin, I know Germany's had data protection laws for a really long time. So when the GDPR came along, you probably thought, okay, well, we have already been doing this under our local laws, so it's not such a big change. But in some countries where you haven't had a culture of data protection. Now suddenly the GDPR comes along, and now you've got to change that culture. So a lot of people have been, collecting as much data for as long as possible and never deleting the data. Collecting a lot of data about a person that they don't really need to achieve the purpose. It's just been I think it's just been a culture of collect, use the data as much as possible, perhaps sell the data, it's very valuable. And now the GDPR has come along and said, actually, no. And I always say to people, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if you don't take the holistic approach, if you don't change the culture within your organization and then everybody needs to understand that GDPR is important. If they don't understand that, it's really easy to have a data breach because you have that one person who's your weakest link, and then they go and cause a data breach. So, they send some sensitive, let's say, data out via email to the wrong Tracy, and there we go, there's a data breach. So you have to be really careful, and like I said, IT can put in all the firewalls, all the security, they could try their best, but you just have one person with admin access not understanding what they're doing, and there's a data breach, and then you could get in trouble with the supervisory authority. So I think that's key. A key takeaway of today's session is, what is your holistic approach to GDPR? And, have you appointed, perhaps if you're in a larger organization, have you appointed some data champions to manage that? I don't know, Wouter, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but have you had any instances of, data breaches that you've come across that you thought, oh, maybe this could be avoided, or, emails being sent out, or have you heard of anything?
Sure. So we've been lucky, not lucky. We've been set up proper, so we haven't had data breaches, which is wonderful. But to touch on the culture part, right? Like that's where we started, because we started really small. We started with 4 people, and we're now over 30 people and over 9 different countries, and basically all continents, in the APAC, in EMEA, in the US. So very much kind of what you're saying, like everybody comes with a different background, and starting with the right culture, especially for startup, where some things are normal, that you don't have access to XYZ, or that it's, we treat production data totally different than test data, and we ensure there is test data so that engineering doesn't need to mess with production data. And I think that's preventing some of the unintended breaches. But that mindset started very early on. So then when somebody new comes and joins the team, that's the expectation, and they will match that. But it's very purposeful. So luckily we haven't had a breach, and to be a part of the culture is huge, and to do that from the start, because I know in a startup you have 20 million things to do, and the most important thing is closing deals, is getting money.
Yes.
But these are foundational things. Like, if you really look through this from an engineering lens, this is almost like a non-functional requirement, but it can really bog down your business. So we had to focus on it from the beginning, and now I am thankful we did put in some extra effort way in the beginning to make this a part of the culture, because it's so much easier now to manage versus to clean up broken processes.
100%. So you're not so far down the line where you have to work backwards. You started from the beginning, and I think that's a great message. Is we actually call it privacy by design in the field. It's just thinking about privacy from the get-go. So yes, as Wouter said, you've got a lot going on in a startup. You obviously want to make money, you want to be profitable, but if you start doing privacy by design, approaching the culture correctly, it'll make your GDPR compliance a lot easier. So of course, I've got a metaphor for you, and this is a man running, and it's actually in my home city. So this photo is taken on Signal Hill, and there's Devil's Peak in the background. And if any of you have ever been to Cape Town, Table Mountain sitting there just on the right. And I like this metaphor of running, because if you just started running, you've just started your running journey, you're very physically unfit. You can only run about 2-3 kilometers, and you're completely out of breath. And that might be where you're starting right now. So if you're just starting your GDPR process, you're thinking, oh my gosh, there's this massive mountain I have to climb. I'm feeling really nervous. Or, as we just said, you're thinking about profits, you're thinking about making your product work. You're not thinking about the GDPR. And the GDPR, yes, in the beginning, it can be quite challenging because you're unfit. And there are quite a few things that you need to do. Obviously at Scytale, we can help guide you through the process. But once you get physically fit, it just becomes so much easier. So any of you who may be runners in the room today, once you get into it, 5Ks isn't so difficult. Then maybe you start running 10Ks, and maybe you start running 15Ks. But as you become more and more physically fit, the compliance with GDPR becomes a lot easier. Also, unfortunately, this isn't the fun part about compliance, but it's just something that you constantly need to think about. So it's definitely not a tick box exercise. It's not perhaps like a SOC 2 or an ISO where it's something that you can audit. It's physically tangible. There's a tick box of things you need to do. As I said, GDPR compliance is doing what is necessary in the circumstance to comply. And it just has to be something that becomes part of your organization. And as with physical fitness, you just have to keep up with it. So like I said in the beginning, it's going to be quite challenging. But as you continue on and on, the running will get easier, the compliance with GDPR will get easier, and it'll just become a natural part of your processes. So yeah, I don't know about Wouter. Have you found that it was challenging in the beginning, and that it's getting easier as you go along?
Yeah, I think especially in the combination of us also obtaining our SOC 2 certification and ISO and GDPR, that one these things kind of complement each other because you do something for one certification, it supports the other.
100%.
That starting that was painful and took a lot of effort. Maintaining it is a lot easier, but also because that's now the way you do it, right? Like to get access to data, you had to fill out a ticket and reasoning why, and you set up some automation through either Jira or HubSpot or whatever. And now once that automation is built, it's no more pain. So to me, as also as an organization, is like as we're growing, we're getting better at these processes, especially the automation, so that actually, like go back to the running, that sometimes I may just get a lift from a bike and cheat on my to get to the 10K, because I can definitely not run a 10K, but if I can sit on the back of a bike for 5 kilometers, hey, I may just make it. And I think, like, as you find these processes and you automate it and use platforms like Scytale or like other flows in HubSpot or G Suite, it makes this running so much easier and consistent. Um, I almost feel like that was the hard part, to get to the right processes where you're not limiting your employees, but yet being safe and continue to have speed in your company.
So do you feel like the automation helps take those walls away, those challenges away?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when we, for example, we had to secure our endpoints for SOC 2, but it's
Hmm.
also important to kind of see what happens with the data. And some of the engineers was like, "Oh, great! I used to work at a bank. Now I cannot do anything. I need to have full access to everything because otherwise, I cannot be effective for core for you." And I think when you set up automation, to have the end user in mind, which in a lot of cases are your employees, right? Or your partners or whomever are in your company adding value, that when you do automation, that you not necessarily look only at like, well, we got to be compliant, but how are we compliant? And they can still achieve their goal of being agile and working effectively and having the freedom to make choices, but with guardrails. Um, like an example, like we leverage G Suite, Google really heavily, where people are in certain organizational departments, and you can limit what shared folders they see. And that seems like something really simple, but if you're just adding people, sometimes you forget. right? And now I know when I hire somebody in engineering, I'm going to put them in the engineering department, and they will automatically be walled off. And that way, they are optimized to do their job and have access to the data they need to have their job, and don't have access to data that they don't need. So they can also not make that mistake. But we purposefully thought about it to give them the right data to do their job. Yeah.
100%. And I think that's really what the GDPR and the security principles are all about, is that obviously you need to empower people to do their job, but you also don't want to have that weakest link, where like Wouter said, you've obviously cordoned off the data and you're protecting this data from this data. So that's really, really important. And I think what Wouter also touched on is important, is that if you've done a SOC 2 or an ISO 27000 compliance, it really makes GDPR compliance a lot easier. So for those of you that are new to GDPR, there are 7 principles that you need to comply with. So data minimization, accuracy, storage, there's all these principles. And one of the key principles is security. And I always tell people that you cannot have information security without good data protection, and vice versa. The two absolutely go hand in hand. And I would say if you've completed your SOC 2 or your ISO, from a security point of view, your GDPR compliance is just that much easier. So it's almost a leg up. So you're like this man, you're running already on the hill. So you're not at the bottom of the mountain, you're at the top of the hill, and now you've got a little bit further to go up the mountain. But it's just not as difficult. So I think today some important questions to ask ourselves. I don't know why this is not loading now.
We see it.
Oh, can you see it? Okay.
Yeah. When must I comply with GDPR?
All right, great. Because it's just a little spinning wheel of death on my side, but that's fine. We'll let me just quickly.
Yeah, I can help you out, Tracy. So the first one here is: do I process personal data of US citizens? Is my business based in the EU? Do I target EU citizens? Are customers asking about my GDPR compliance? The gold standard approach. That's the slide.
Perfect. Okay, I'm glad that you can see it, because on my side it's just a wheel of death. But anyway, I've got it on my computer now. So I think a lot of people have come to me being really confused and really stressed out, and being unsure about when they need to actually comply with the GDPR. So there's obviously a scope of application to this law. As I said before, it's got tentacles, so it's a very wide scope of application, but it doesn't necessarily apply if you're sitting in Australia, for instance, and you're focused on Australian citizens and you're an Australian company. You don't just automatically need to comply with the GDPR. So these are the questions that you need to be asking yourself. So firstly, do I process the personal data of EU citizens? So processing is a very broad word. So it could mean storing data, editing data, deleting data, maybe you've got a server with the data. Anything like that actually counts as processing under the GDPR. So if you've got personal data of EU citizens, that's definitely a big tick of, yes, you need to comply with the GDPR. Then, is my business based in the EU? So that's another obvious one. Yes. If I am an EU-based business, then obviously I need to comply with the GDPR. If I'm targeting EU citizens, I also need to comply. And then, are your customers asking about GDPR compliance? So I think that's quite important. So sometimes maybe you haven't thought about GDPR compliance, but your customers have been asking about this. So I don't know, Wouter, in your experience, could you say that was maybe something that also motivated you on this journey, is that people and customers started asking you about your GDPR compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the, well, I don't want to say the main drivers, but one of the drivers is that as we are selling to financial institutions, that these are some of the standard questions as you show up as any company, that they ask standard RFP or vendor due diligence questions on, are you, one of the questions, GDPR compliant? And
Mm-hmm.
I think, as everybody here in the audience is probably also like, growing out your startup, and that getting to a customer and they recognize that you've got a better product, but yet you're really risky, right? Like, are you going to exist next year? Like, you're a startup. Like, they may just want to stay with the incumbent just out of kind of like this false sense of security. And for us, one of the motivations was to have these checkboxes, not just as a checkbox, but to also prove that you're mature as an organization, right? We may be young, but we weren't born yesterday, and we all had lives before we did this startup. And it's showing when you are GDPR compliant, and if you thought about it, and that you got your answers ready, or that you have your SOC and ISO in place. I think it's de-risking your profile as a startup, that as you go into the market, control the things that you can control. And this is one of the things you can control, that you have confidence that you do this right, and that the data is safe, and that you can exude that confidence to your clients. And with that, you can sell faster and better. Because showing up, especially business to business, to a bank, and they ask you 3 questions and you don't have an answer, they're going to stop asking questions and move on. Because to this is table stakes, right? Like, this is a bare minimum to have as you start the process of selling into some of these larger clients. So for us, it was a huge motivation to have this part of our house in order, but like super in order, so that we know we have a risky profile, and you de-risk it as the longer your company exists, but that what we can control, we need to control. And this is a part that you can control.
100%. 100% agree with everything you just said. Yeah, and I think it just gives you such a business edge, if you can say, yes, we are a startup, but we're not risky because we've been taking GDPR compliance seriously since the beginning. Yeah, 100% agree with you. We have a question from one of our audience members that says, we are an organization in the Gulf countries. We have EU citizens working in our organization. Is it mandatory to be fully compliant with the GDPR? So that's a great question. And that goes on to my 5th point here, which is the gold standard approach. So as I said earlier, I think sometimes it can get a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're operating in a global space, about, okay, well, as one of our audience members, they've got GDPR citizens working for them, but you're not sitting in Europe. Or, yes, I'm targeting EU citizens, or I might have some EU citizens in my database, but actually American citizens are my main target market. Or I think sometimes it becomes mind-boggling. So when it starts to become mind-boggling and it becomes overwhelming, especially if you are practicing in a global space, then I would definitely advise that you follow the GDPR approach, just because it is the gold standard law. So right now it's the most, I would say the most mature data protection law there is. It's very well documented. It's, there's a lot of case law and writings about it. There's tangible things to follow at the moment. Whereas in other countries, maybe you've got a data protection law, but no one's really done anything about it. There's not a lot of guidance. And then what I think is also really interesting is that data protection law around the world is actually 80% similar. So I think that makes my life as a lawyer a little bit more easier, is that generally we are following the same principles and, over and over again. So I think, if you are sitting in a Gulf country, firstly, look at, I know Dubai has some data protection laws, for instance. So firstly, think about, okay, well, what are my local laws? And how similar are those local laws to the GDPR? If they're pretty similar, find that 80% and start following that. And then just look at your little bit of outliers. So now and again, there'll be a few outliers. For instance, in data subject access rights, data portability is big in Europe. It's not necessarily big in South Africa. In South Africa, we protect account numbers, not as much as you do in Europe. So those would be, my jurisdiction versus European jurisdiction. those would be those slight differences. So I would generally follow the gold standard approach, which is GDPR, and then just do those few little outliers. But there's no harm in going with the GDPR. I think as I'm reading the question so long, we have a poll. So I'm just going to ask Melissa if you could please run the poll for us. That's my assistant sitting in the background, just because I don't know, the slides have decided not to load on my side. So here is our poll, and we're asking today is, what type of personal data are you collecting? So remember, I said that's one of the first questions you need to ask yourselves is, what type of data? Where's my risk? So is it sensitive? Is it low risk? Is it maybe company data, financial data, anonymized data? I think that's really where a good understanding comes from about, where you need to go in terms of your GDPR compliance. Okay. Yes, Wouter.
No, I think the last question here asked by around ChatGPT use is very interesting.
Yes, I will delve into it in a moment.
To hear your answer on that.
Okay, so I see we've got the results. I'm interested to see that it's actually quite across the board in terms of the type of data that our audience is collecting. So we've got a few people that have got sensitive data. So that's your health, biometric, race, those types of data. Obviously, if you are in that field and you've got a lot of sensitive data, GDPR is of utmost importance to you. Low risk data, you've got your names, surnames, addresses. So I know you think, okay, well, that's maybe publicly available data. I can get that on the internet. But even if it is publicly available data and it's very low risk, like names and surnames, it doesn't mean it isn't still covered by the GDPR. So don't fall into that trap, even if something's publicly available. And then we've got a few people that have just company data. So always just investigate that type of data that you have and say, okay, well, is there any personal data within this data set that I need to obviously protect? Or is it mainly confidential data like intellectual property data, maybe mining data or copyrighted data, but, pricing data, but that's just data. It doesn't necessarily have any personal data within it. So obviously you would want to then just protect that from a security or SOC 2 point of view. And then if you've got any anonymized or statistical data, that's obviously an exception under the GDPR. So that's quite exciting there, is that, if you've got any of that data, then you don't have to worry. So that's quite exciting. Okay. I think I'm going to be one of those annoying people, but can you see my screen? And does it say what is personal data?
Yes, Tracy.
Okay, great. I'm glad that is working for the audience, because it just says can't upload file, which is just great. Okay. So what we're the reason for obviously doing the poll is we were focusing on what type of personal data are you collecting. And like I said, in knowing the type of personal data you have, that obviously guides your GDPR compliance. So you need to do what is reasonable in the circumstance to comply. If you're sitting here and you're asking yourselves, but Tracy, what is personal data even? It's data that identifies a living natural person, either directly or indirectly. So obviously it's a human being. They are living. So what's quite interesting is that people who are deceased, the GDPR no longer applies to them, but you're obviously under an ethical duty to still protect that data. And you need to either directly identify a person or indirectly. So directly, that does seem fairly self-explanatory. So it's Tracy's name, her address, maybe her IP address, her location. I've put race and gender here. That type of data is obviously under a special category, so it needs to be a little bit more protected than your normal pool of data. There are a few types of data under the GDPR called special categories of data. Generally, you'd find them in HR departments, for instance, because a law is telling you to process that type of data. So don't worry if a law is telling you to do something, you are allowed to do it. But you will come across like maybe race, ethnic, gender, that type of data quite a lot in HR departments. But yeah, as you can see, there's that would be data that directly identifies someone, and then you can also indirectly identify somebody. So that could be data where, if you take two data sets and you take 1 + 2 = 3, if that equals 3 then is able to identify Tracy, then that also would mean that it is covered under the GDPR. So as you can see, it's quite a wide application. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to some questions. So we've got hello from Nick from Cyprus. That just sounds so lovely. Cyprus sounds so amazing. Would you please advise if the below procedure simplifies the way to follow GDPR, so the data privacy framework? Okay, I'm not going to open the link right now, but I do have some opinions on data privacy frameworks. As I said, you can't really do a to-do list or a checkbox or tick box exercise when it comes to GDPR. However, I am 100% not opposed to data privacy frameworks. I think people need some guidance, especially if you're doing this for the first time. I think it can be quite challenging. It can be, very daunting. So, you might be thinking to yourself, I just don't know where to start. And 100%, I think a framework is a great idea. Like I said, you are still in charge with deciding, okay, we've got sensitive data, we've got low risk data, we've only got confidential data. So you're still in charge with deciding how much you comply with each principle under the framework. But I think it is a fantastic way to guide you. So yes, I would definitely start with that as a starting point. Okay, and then I'll get to the next question in a bit, just because that is just it's a whole other debate, ChatGPT. But just while we're concentrating on the GDPR, I think it is a must for many companies. But obviously, like I said, compliance can be very time consuming. It can be complicated. That's why privacy frameworks are great. As Wouter and I touched on earlier, you could have a tight deadline just because, you're a company, for instance, that you're dealing with. Let's say you are dealing with a bank or maybe an insurance company, and they want to know, are you GDPR compliant? To get that, that tender or that contract, you need to obviously work quite quickly to get compliant as quick as possible. So then you would, if we talk about the marathon run again, you're going to be a trail runner and you're going to run really fast up the mountain. So that's going to be quite challenging in the beginning, but then, once you get into it, it'll get easier. And then, sometimes there can be quite high costs when it comes to non-compliance. So I think just to touch on non-compliance is that there are obviously consequences when it comes to non-compliance. So I think some of the obvious ones, like I have touched on earlier, is that you can have really tough fines. That's an obvious one. But you can also have really negative publicity. So, if you are in the banking sector, maybe you're a credit bureau. I know it's happened in South Africa, for instance, where we've actually had credit bureaus that have had massive data breaches. And today, I mean, that was a few years ago, but I still, when I think about those credit bureaus, I still think about, my word, they weren't protecting our data. So, as they say, reputation can take 20 years to build and absolutely minutes or hours to just crumble beneath your feet. So I think that's really important considering the type of industry that you're in. What's also important, as I touched on, is losing out on business. So if you're saying to your suppliers or your customers, oh gosh, we can't really say we're GDPR compliant right now, they're not going to sign those contracts with you. You also don't want to have any complaints to any of the supervisory authorities. So you want to obviously deal with the complaints internally. You want your customers to come to you. So hopefully you can resolve those complaints before it goes to any of the supervisory authorities. I think what's also important to note is that, maybe right now in the beginning, you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, this is just, such an absolute mission. GDPR, roll my eyes. However, don't forget that your company has a lot of sensitive information that, just you wouldn't want to get out. It's your IP. You've worked really, really hard on your product, and you wouldn't want to suffer a data breach yourself because you don't want that data out in the public. So you're not having your SOC 2, your ISO, and your GDPR compliance ducks in a row, for instance, then you could be at risk of losing your own data, which it can be incredibly harmful to your business if your data were to leak. And then within your local jurisdiction, you might also then face local fines or even criminal charges. So in South Africa, for instance, you could perhaps go to jail. It's actually in our law. If you breach our data protection law, you could go to jail, which is quite scary. I don't think it's likely to happen, but it is there. Otherwise, like I said, there could be local fines. There could also be your GDPR fines, publicity. There's all these consequences of non-compliance. I don't know, Wouter, do any of these things keep you up at night?
Yeah, I will keep going back to the losing out on business, right? Like that's the one we're trying to prevent and stay ahead of. Not just GDPR, but other things too. Like control the things that you can control, and of course, like data breaches. Like that's the last thing you want, because that's also a lot of energy wasted. Because it's 100% rework, and you try to mitigate something that you could have prevented, and now we're all spending time on not working for our customers, right? Like, so it's it can create a lot of work. I can only imagine, and luckily we haven't had to deal with that yet. But yeah, I think preventing is a lot better than curing later. As you started out, like losing your reputation is it's way harder. It's way easier than to build it. So
yes, 100%. Yeah, it's just something that can obviously crumble in a matter of moments. Um, as we are obviously getting towards the end of the presentation, I just wanted to chat on with you or touch base with you on, do you have any advice that you would give to startups that in the beginning phases of their journey towards compliance?
yeah, I think start early, right? Like make it a part of your foundation. As a startup, um, you're building out so many things, and sure, you're cutting corners left and right. But sometimes to make choices to make this a foundational part of your journey, managing it with 4 employees is a lot easier than with 30. And if your foundations are in place, then scaling out becomes a lot more secure, and it helps you to prosper better. So don't make it a let's do this next month, because as soon as you said earlier, and I keep going back on like selling, that's in the end where as a startup it's important. um, when that one big customer does ask the question, you need to have a confident answer. Yes, we have this in check, and we can prove it, and we have done this and that, and that you come across knowledgeable and that you know what you're doing. Having that from the start should be a foundational building block in any startup. So my biggest advice is start it from the start, make it a priority, because it will accelerate your success later.
100%. Yeah, like we said, you build it from the beginning, you build that culture in, and it will just make your life so much easier. And then, of course, to delve into our big question here is that someone from the audience asks, is there any conflict between data protection law and chat GPT use when it comes to customer data? 100% yes. So I think I'm still trying to get my mind around big data and the GDPR, just because these AI models, they require so much vast amounts of data to to be able to work. So here we are inputting vast and vast and vast amounts of data, and there's going to be a lot of personal information or personal data within that data set. And I don't think that any of these people, expected their data to be used in this way. There's no notification to the data subject. There's no transparency. So yeah, I think it's our biggest challenge of of our time is how do we marry AI with GDPR and proper privacy and data protection. Um, it's actually I think someone could write a PhD on this, to be honest. It's really it's just
So, well,
I've been asked this before. Yes, Martin.
yeah, and like our approach, because I think ChatGPT is an amazing tool,
Yeah.
but we have a standard rule where none of our production data or client data can go in there, right? Like we cannot have it processed, because my understanding is, maybe wrong, but we're staying on the safe side. Any data you give in there, it stays in there, right? It makes the model smarter and smarter, and it comes into the public domain.
Yes.
Now, we're all assuming that they will anonymize and this and that, and maybe, but maybe not, right? Like, um, so our rule is that if you want to use it to optimize a process or whatever, right? Like, you cannot use real data. You gotta use it as a test or make us smarter, but we cannot, give a whole like onboarding of a customer and then tell ChatGPT do this and that. There's other tools out there that are 100% secure, that can process and automate, that you can control. So for this use, production data and customers' data is not allowed in ChatGPT.
I think that is a wonderful rule, and definitely something that perhaps you yourself should also think about having as a hard rule within your organization. Just because, as Wouter said, we don't know what ChatGPT is doing with that data. If you're putting confidential data, personal data into that model, I really don't think it's being anonymized as much as they say it is. It's the model is learning from itself. There's a lot of machine learning taking place, but your personal data and your confidential data is sitting within that model. So I agree that's probably the best way to approach it. Is that don't use real data. I've also actually come across another recent startup that. It almost sits between ChatGPT and your company, and it prevents any customer data from actually going into the model. It actually protects and ring fences your employees and that data. So I think that's quite a clever startup. But yeah, definitely something to think about when it comes to ChatGPT. And then just to oh, so sorry, while we're on that, so Martin says, so is it enough if you just have a written policy regarding the use of ChatGPT? Well, that's the thing with policies. It's all well and good to have many policies, but it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is actually following that policy. So I think that is where I think that's where we go back to uh, the holistic approach that I spoke about in the beginning, is that you need to have that cultural change within your business. You need every employee to understand that this is actually serious business, and that yes, this is the policy, but you actually need to be following that policy, and there is consequences, unfortunately, if you aren't following that policy. And also from a data protection point of view, you're breaching the GDPR. So
Yeah.
yes, it is very challenging to actually monitor employees if you don't have the ring fencing in place.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, this is where culture is key, right? Like,
Yes.
in our company, we start from a place from yes and not from no. So you want to do something, how do I enable you to do your job most effectively? First is
Mm.
saying you're not allowed to do that, you're not allowed to do that. So there is masking in place. There is a way to generate test data off of live use cases so that we can then use that in models like ChatGPT. But you got to be having an active conversation with everybody involved. Yeah, this is a culture thing. Just having a policy that's somewhere hidden away, that somebody signed during onboarding, yeah, of course, it's going to be super ineffective. That's a check in the box, and that's, I think, exactly the intent of this whole thing. It's like, it's a mindset, and especially at a startup, everybody needs to understand that, like, you can take the ship down, one person, right? In a big corporation is maybe different, but most of us here, like, you're still in a very fragile state, and everybody needs to realize the, Spider-Man saying, with great what is it? With great powers come great responsibilities. That everybody has huge Spider-Man powers in a startup, and that comes with the responsibilities.
100%. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think also, if every employee is following the cultural mindset, you almost check up on each other. So maybe you're friends with one of your colleagues and you're chatting about something, and then you hear, okay, but no, you shouldn't be using ChatGPT. You start checking up on each other, and making sure that everybody is following the right approach and the policies. So yeah, I think everything, once again, it all just keeps coming back to your holistic and cultural approach. Somebody asked if I could share the name of the startup. Their name is Lasso. So I'm punting at Lasso here, but it is definitely an amazing startup. And then from the slide, you can also see these are the various security frameworks or compliance frameworks that we have at Scytale. So, obviously today I've touched quite a lot on the GDPR. There's also the CCPA. So that is for Californian residence data. So I think if you're processing, I think it's over 50,000 records of Californian residents. You've got a big, let's say you've got a big focus on California, and you're making over $25 million in revenue. So obviously a very successful business. Then the CCPA does definitely apply to you. Once again, like I said, if you do have a focus within the US market, right now the US doesn't have a federal law covering data protection. There is talks that there's one in the works. So I really hope so, because that would be really great. But for the meantime, if you are in the US but you're not California focused, I would then once again recommend you do a GDPR focus, just because I do think that the US law is going to be pretty similar to the GDPR. So if you've got the GDPR boxes ticked already, then it'll help you so much more when the US law finally comes into play. And then, like I said, there's your SOC 2, your ISOs, your SOC 1s. Those are all really important laws that'll just help you with your GDPR compliance. And then if you, for instance, focused on patients in America, so people who are receiving any sort of medical treatment in America, then we've obviously got HIPAA, which is the privacy and security law for health data, also pretty similar to the GDPR. So once again, everything just seems to I would say, overlap with each other. But I see we've got 5 minutes left. So I think if you've got maybe one final question you'd like to ask, you can pop it in the chat. Otherwise, you can always reach out to myself on LinkedIn. You can click the Learn More button on our page here, and you can go to Scytale's website. So that's where we've got all this information about our product. We've obviously got a GDPR framework, which has got really great templates, which it can help you with your compliance, as well as you'll have access to me. So at any time, you'll be able to have meetings with me. I'll be able to advise you, we'll give you bespoke legal advice on your compliance journey. Otherwise, I think another really great thing is, if you are interested in Scytale, you can always book a demo with us, and then you'll speak to one of our consultants who will, just be able to take you through exactly what does your company need, what type of compliance, what type of framework. And yeah, we are really, we specialize in startups. We want to get you compliant as quick as possible. And yes, the recording will be available afterwards, so don't worry about that. Otherwise, I don't see any other questions? So, like I said, you've got 4 more minutes to ask a question. Otherwise, I will thank my guest, Wouter. Thank you so much for joining me today. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to wrap up with.
Oh, always. So one, I did start my compliance journey at a different platform and moved to Scytale. I think the big difference that Scytale offers, and I'm not being paid for this, but there is more of a hands-on approach. So it's technology and human. And especially as we were learning as a startup, that made a big difference for us. It gave us a lot more speed because I don't necessarily have the funds to, hire a full-time dedicated compliance person, nor is that needed. So combining the human and the technology has really helped us and gained us speed. We've got SOC 2 Type 2 compliance, we got ISO compliance, and GDPR. So we have it all like nicely neat together, which is giving us a lot of speed. Now my final thought is like, don't let this be an afterthought. Just make it a part of your culture. And actually GDPR, a lot of it makes sense. I would want other companies to treat me like that. So a lot of the rules that I'm reading is like, yeah, makes sense. I haven't really come across something that you go like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So a lot of it is also just common sense, but you got to protect against stupid, I guess. And that's so that's my advice. Start early.
Thank you so much, Wouter. Yes, 100% agree. We are all data subjects in the room. So we want our data protected. So we need to protect other people's data. Once again, thank you so much for joining me and being such a wonderful guest. And thank you to our audience. I hope you found this session very informative. Like I said, if you want to reach out, you can just go onto the Scytale website, book a demo. Otherwise, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to help. And thank you once again. And hopefully see you again soon. Thank you.
Good luck, everyone. Bye.